Hello, my name is Alexis and I'm the community archaeologist at Fulham Palace. So welcome to the lockdown lectures, and the lecture I'm giving today is on Fulham Palace before the bishops, so essentially the history and archaeology of the palace up to the establishment of kind of the first bishop of London on the site, as it were. So if you don't know Fulham Palace, which I hope most of you do, it is indeed a scheduled ancient monument, and it was formerly a moated site as well. So scheduled ancient monument are number 134, and therefore before any archaeology takes place on the site we have to get consent from Historic England to undertake any work. So it's a very important site with a very long history. So this slide here essentially shows what the site was like in the 19th century. So you can see the large moat which surrounded the entire site, which was backfilled in the 1920s. So the moat is no longer visible, but you can see how it was a very significant, substantial site surrounded by a large watercourse, essentially, which was, I believe, the largest domestic moat in England. So an incredibly significant feature surrounding the site. So in terms of a brief history of the site, well, we don't actually know how old that moat is. It's been suggested it might have Iron Age or possibly Danish origins, but we certainly have a lot of archaeology here. So that goes right back to the late Mesolithic, early Neolithic. We've got evidence of Bronze Age activity as well, some Iron Age too, and a lot of excavations have taken place on the site. They've revealed evidence of 4th century occupation, including ditches as well as structural evidence. The manor of the bishops of London was established on the site during the Saxon or early medieval period. And the moat, or the Magna Fossa, as it's documented in 1392, may well be referenced, in fact, as early as between 1163 and 1180. So the palace itself underwent various alterations during the 13th, 14th and 15th century and was at its largest size in the 17th century. The walled garden, which is still standing, is one of the sort of more impressive features that you'll see on the site, and that was established during the bishop of the reign or the tenure of Bishop Terrick between 1764 and 1777. So a nice 18th century walled garden. But what is it that makes Fulham Palace such a well settled and well established site? Well, one of the main reasons for this lies in what's actually underneath the ground. So typically something that archaeologists use an awful lot when they look at a site is what we call a geology map. And the geology map of this area of London shows that the site lies upon the Kempton Park River terrace gravels, which are lovely free draining sandy soils. So the land rises from the Thames towards the Fulham Palace Road, rises away from the Thames towards the Fulham Palace Road. And it's been suggested that the site is proximate to a ford which once crossed the Thames from Fulham to Putney. So the river would have been fordable at that point, meaning that it was a good plot of land for being able to cross the Thames as well. And that ford, we believe, is near the present-day Putney Bridge. So we know that the site of Fulham Palace itself, as it is now, has been part of the Bishop of London's estate since AD 704. It remained as a manor house of the bishops of London and as an official residence until the last bishop left in 1973. And we have a bishop's residence being recorded on the site as early as 1104. Now it may well be that it goes back much further than that, but that's the first recorded evidence we have of a palace or a manor on this site. So this may have been located, this very early residence, within what we call the Homestead Moat, which is technically in the northwest corner of the site, or the paddock, or possibly on the north lawn, where we've certainly got some evidence for some very early medieval walls. During the 13th century, the palace was rebuilt in its current location. So if you visit the site now, the area that you see, the current cafe and sort of dining rooms, etc., that's pretty much where the original medieval palace was, or the palace dating to the 13th century. So the name Fulham, what does it mean? Well, it's believed to have been a marshy area close to the Thames, supposedly low-lying and prone to flooding, and it may well be that the name is simply a reference to this wet state, as in Foulham, as in a wet area. Others suggest that it's in fact a reference to an individual, and somebody named Fuller perhaps, as in Fuller's settlement in the low-lying bend of a river. But the geology, as you've seen on that map there with the Kempton Park River terrace gravels, certainly indicates the site was located upon really good, suitable land for settlement and farming. So rather than being this kind of conceived wet area by the Thames, it was in fact lovely, free draining, fantastic plot of land, which suggests that's why we have so much archaeology here, because it's been settled for its very, very good geological conditions. But one of the main things that we have to think about when we're looking back that far in time is that the Thames was very different to how it is now. Now we see very much so a canalised Thames with big river walls and embankments on either side of the Thames River. But back then, it was what we call a braided river system, so it was much, much wider. And there would have been lots of little islands as these sort of little rivulets and rivers sort of weaved their way around these plots of land. So a much wider sort of and broader, perhaps slightly shallower river, rather than the river that we see today. Which raises the question of whether or not our site was an ayat or an eight, or possibly an eight, in the sense that the moat is incredibly large, up to a mile long, which suggests it may in fact be a natural watercourse rather than a man-made or hand-excavated feature, as it were. Even now, when you look at this area of the River Thames on Google Maps, which you can see here, there are several ayats along the length of the river, including Isleworth Ayat, Chiswick Ayat, and Brentford Ayat as well. So one of the theories is in fact that Fulham, or the land that Fulham Palace stands on now, was in fact one of these islands. And funnily enough, when we look at Roke there in 1741-5, which is his map that he drew, and a lovely plot of the palace that is as well, he's actually referring to it as the eights. That may well be a reference to an eight or an ayat. And as you can see there again, that moat, by this point very much so canalised and very much so a kind of prominent landscape feature. But the origins of that may well date back to when the Thames was much broader and wider. For instance, or as an example, if you look here at Bermondsey as it is now, you can see it's very much so developed. The railway lines going into London Bridge, etc. And a very much so an embanked part of the River Thames and a very, very well settled part of the Thames. But if you go back to the Roman period, you can in fact see there how different it was. You have the two islands in the top left-hand corner there, the North Island and the South Island, which are roughly where sort of London Bridge is now. And then Bermondsey to the southeast, which is a large peninsula, with Horsley Down Ayat to the north. So you can see how wide the river was and how these weaving channels spread around the area. So there's no reason to think that Fulham would have been any different to this. And that may well explain why we have this potential island and this wonderful site. Southwark is, of course, very rich in archaeology as well, and is a really interesting place for archaeologists to dig with a lot of really interesting Roman material on it. So one of the first things that we have to look at when we're looking at the archaeology of Fulham Palace is the late Mesolithic to early Neolithic transition. So this is around about 4,000 years BC. So towards the end of the Mesolithic, sand began to accrete in the Thames and it became more meandering, so slightly more rolling, again, that kind of braided river system that we were looking at earlier. The sand deposition led to the development of ayats, or islands, which are identified as isolated topographic highs which should naturally have an attraction for human groups. So you can see the point I'm getting at here. Essentially, if Fulham, or the land that Fulham Palace is on now, was one of these islands or one of these ayats, it would have been an incredibly attractive place for people to come and settle, or at least visit to undertake certain activities. So the Thames itself, what's going on at the time? Well, this may be associated with a rise in water levels, particularly within lower valleys which drain into coastal water. So again, if you're looking at the lower ends of the Thames estuary, you may see these water levels rising, and you may see this is why there's more activity going on. By this point, the Thames was broad, it was shallow, it was moderately fast-flowing river, and roughly followed its modern course. But in terms of these islands or ayats, they don't actually appear to have been cultivated until the Bronze Age. But they do certainly seem to have been visited at the very least. So what are the main issues that we have in Fulham Palace? Well, we certainly got a lot of evidence to late Mesolithic to early Neolithic. This is mostly in the form of flint. The problem is it's incredibly hard to identify features dating to this period, and few have been discovered. So what we're left with is what we call background noise. So the bulk of the material that we've got comprises artifactual evidence, mostly in the form of flint. And there's a lot of this late Mesolithic to early Neolithic flint on the Fulham Palace site. Now, one of the questions that we looked at during the Dovecot dig in 2017 is we actually have a very early feature. This was found in one of the trenches sort of next to the main drive, and it was a small pit that you can just see in that section on the left-hand side, that was filled with sort of burnt animal bone and a tiny bit of flint. So there's the flint that came out of it, and that's a prismatic blade. The pit also contained a cremated bone, and this has been identified as belonging to a horse, so you've got a potential horse cremation there as well. Now you do see similar Mesolithic features in Charlwood in Surrey, so it could be a Mesolithic pit, but they are quite unusual, and it is a bit sort of tricky to look at it in that sort of sense. So although the flint's Mesolithic, there is a lot kicking around on the site. It might have got in there as being redeposited, but we certainly have evidence of defleshing horse bones in the Bronze Age, which is why it's led me to initially think that feature may be Bronze Age, but it could, of course, looking at that blade, be late Mesolithic to early Neolithic in origin. So how do we mark the transition between these two periods? Well, the Mesolithic is generally viewed as a period of hunting and gathering, where the society was functioning in a sort of nomadic and transitory way. Now, during the Neolithic, things begin to change when farming starts. Society starts to become more static, less nomadic, although this is much clearer in the later Neolithic than in the early Neolithic. So the theory is the Neolithic arrived in Britain suddenly and as a package, consequent upon a massive expansion of the agrarian lifestyle into the higher latitudes of Europe towards the end of the 5th millennium BC. Well, that's one theory, according to Ellaby. Alternatively, it could have been a slower process, so it's difficult to see what's going on exactly, given the archaeological record hasn't produced sort of definitive evidence for this. There are, however, certain signifiers. So if we look at the hand axe on the left-hand side, or the transient axe as it is, this is Mesolithic, and this was actually one that was found in Ewell. The one on the right is the lovely early Neolithic ground and polished axe from the Vicarage Garden at Fulham Palace. And you can see the difference there. So you've got one that's quite rough, the Mesolithic version, and this lovely sort of ground and polished version on the right-hand side there. So the early Neolithic witnesses the emergence of carinated pottery vessels as well, along with these lovely axes and also these leaf-shaped arrowheads. And these were often deposited in the ground in or alongside watery contexts as well. So again, you can see possibly why Fulham's so important during this period too. It's a nice island by the river. We're also starting to see this period the development of monuments and long barrows. This is Kit's Coty down in Kent. So there is quite a fundamental change occurring between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. So how do we look at Fulham in this context then? Well, it is obscure here, and it's not so easy to sort of pull it apart. But the artefactual evidence does support an interpretation of occupation, if not permanent settlements. And this could be associated again with that fording point close to Putney Bridge and this development of this eyot on the north bank of the River Thames. No evidence so far for early agriculture on the site, but it does fit into a general pattern of visitation along the banks of the Thames during this period, possibly for hunting and gathering. And the fresh nature of this flint suggests it was produced on site with a material retrieved from the gravel terrace that underlies it. In other words, they're using local flint that's come from the gravel terraces beneath us, and they are napping it or shaping it on site here during the late Mesolithic to early Neolithic period. So, following the late Mesolithic to early Neolithic transition, there isn't a great deal of activity on the site until the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age. It's not clear why that's the case, but during the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, it's about 1000 to sort of 600 or 550 BC, the Thames does witness, or the Thames Valley witnesses a period of agricultural intensification, so it's becoming much, much busier. The sites generally appear to have been pastoral in focus as opposed to arable, with lots of evidence for things like animal droveways, watering holes, field systems and paddocks defining the interpreted pattern. So what we're really seeing here is very much so the emergence of a managed and controlled landscape. So this is another example from Ewell, and this was a site that I excavated in 2015, and it's also where that lovely Mesolithic transient axe came from. But here you can see on the right hand side these huge animal droveways running between the Thames estuary to the north and the higher pastoral land on the South Downs to the south. And as Yates states, all bounded landscapes are focused on the main river, its tributaries, or direct access to the estuary. So you can see why Fulham again would be an important point right by the River Thames. So during our Compton excavation in 2018, we've discovered this rather interesting curvilinear ditch, which you can see here. And this is on the sort of south side of the walled garden, in the area between the walled garden and All Saints Church. But there's this rather interesting sort of curving ditch, as you can see just there, just to the north of the ranging rod. So the question is, what is this feature? Well, it's kind of difficult to interpret, but the main points that we can take from it are that it's curvilinear, appears to be forming a circle. There's no terminals that we can see, although we haven't exposed the entire feature. There's no entrance, there are no post holes, and there's a very small amount of material that we've recovered from it. This would suggest that it isn't a roundhouse, which is a traditional form of Bronze Age dwelling, which would usually have a drip gully or a circular ditch around it, although you would see those post holes in the middle. It's too small for an enclosure, so you can't really put animals in it, and a lack of animal bone would also discount evidence for a paddock. So the interpretation, therefore, is that it's likely to be a small Bronze Age barrow. There's no inhumation within the barrow, so it could be a cenotaph barrow, that's one that's erected when no body's available to be interred, or it's very difficult to look at barrows simply as being graves. It's one of the sort of main issues that we have with it. A lot of people think barrow must be a grave. Not always, they were also monuments. They provide a visual impact on the topography. So they were often located at the centre or on the periphery of family holdings, and they appear to represent territorial compartmentalisation, so that's defining rights over specific resource areas. In other words, if you were coming up the Thames and you saw one of these barrows, you know that there was a family group or a group of people living there, and that this was the territory that they were operating within. So this is an earlier example of a large Bronze Age barrow that I found in Stone Castle in Kent. And again, you can see that large sort of curvilinear quality to it with sort of slots dug throughout it there. You can see it running all the way around. So this is quite similar to what we have here. Again, the whole of the feature isn't exposed there. It's running to what we call the limit of excavation at the top end of the photograph. But again, it bears a lot of similarities to what we found at Fulham Palace. And if you don't know what a barrow looks like, here's some examples from Winterbourne Stoke in Wiltshire. A large collection of Bronze Age barrows there again. And as you can see also, they are quite different sizes. Some are sort of rising above ground, some are almost saucer-like and are kind of flat. So you're not always going to get a mound associated with a barrow, so it's very much so possible that we do indeed have one of these late Bronze Age barrows. Now the problem is, at the end of the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, everything disappears. And as Yates states again, the extent of collapse is so widespread it suggests a general crisis. So we literally see everybody abandoning the Thames Valley. The reasons for this are completely unclear. It could have been due to a collapse in the bronze economy, although another theory suggests maybe that over-farming led to a decline in the quality of land along the floodplain, which would mean that people could no longer farm it. Either way, the area is completely abandoned, and we see exactly the same pattern at Fulham Palace, with the land not really being reoccupied fully until the late Roman period. So what do we know about Roman Fulham, or particularly the Roman settlement at Fulham Palace? Well, the Roman period generally, AD 43 to 410, but as is towards the end of the Roman period, the material that we've got. So the vast majority of the material that we actually find comes from the southern end of the site, so towards the walled garden and towards All Saints Church. What you can see in the picture here is a Nene Valley colour-coated pot lid, which was found during the Orchard excavation in 2015. The other types of pottery that we get generally from the site are Alice Holt Farnham ware and Oxfordshire colour-coated ware. But most significantly, we have something called Portchester D-type ware, and that post-dates AD 350. One of the main issues you have with late Roman pot is it's not brilliantly datable. Most dates you'll get is 200 to 400, but this Portchester D is significant and tells us that we have a settlement here post-AD 350, which is very late. We also have this lovely coin of Arcadius, which was minted between 395 and 408, and that came out of the walled garden again during the Orchard dig in 2015. So another very, very significant piece of evidence suggesting we've got settlement on the site right into the end of the Roman occupation. So again, it does very much so look like a domestic and agricultural settlement. Not a great deal of archaeological features that we've found so far on the site. So again, a lot of that background noise in terms of finding Roman pottery throughout our sort of plough soil sequences. But we do have ditches and pits, with these ditches seemingly representing field boundaries, so it's very much so likely that the site was being used for farming, arable as well as pastoral. And what we can see in the bottom left there is a lovely brooch that came out of the Compton dig, which came out of the ditch that you can see on the right hand side. So we're getting those sort of accoutrements, very much so evidence of people living here during this period and apparently farming. So this was the archaeological excavation undertaken in 1986, and the ditch that you can see there on the right hand side is again a Roman ditch, and that's just sort of north of Bishop Sherlock's room. But you can therefore see there are features extending across the site, although the intensity is much more towards sort of the walled garden end. So what does all this information tell us? Well, during the Orchard project, which was actually 2014, not 2015, more for me, it's been a very long time since I did that dig, but during that dig we got 142 Roman potsherds, which is pretty good, and the Walled Garden project of 2012 we got 36 potsherds. Now that wasn't going as deep as the Orchard project, so that also suggests that, you know, the Roman archaeology is obviously deeper down. With those deeper excavations we're getting more material. So during the Capital Works project, which included the Compton dig, we've got 82 sherds of pot, and the excavations of 1972 to 73, which were just to the sort of west side of the walled garden. We got gravel surfaces, pits, ditch and post hole. So lots and lots of material, again, thousands of sherds of pottery coming out of that excavation in the 70s. But you're also getting things like hypercoarse tile, which is what you'd associate with floor heating systems, and tegulae, which are Roman roof tiles, as well as imbrices, which are the curvy ones, and they're from the roof too, as well as building stone, very much so associated with Roman structures, such as ragstone, chert, hassock stone, chalk, tufa, carstone, and sandstone. So that's all pointing towards the presence of a Roman structure. Also a lot of quernstone found across the site, got some from the Capital Works too, and that's suggesting, you know, that they're farming again and grinding things like corn and possibly metalworking. But all of this information again suggests that there's at least one substantial building once stood here. This all points towards a very late Roman agricultural community residing on the north bank of the River Thames. So the question is why? I mean, why would anybody during the late Roman period want to establish a settlement in Fulham? Because generally speaking, we think that the late Roman period represents a period of decline. But we need to look at the bigger picture. What's actually going on in Britain in the late Roman period? Well, we are seeing a decrease or a decline in the import of goods, such as Samian and pottery from abroad. So you're not seeing those sort of imports coming in anymore. And you're seeing the sort of more like the home-produced pottery that we're getting here. And there are monetary problems in the 3rd century. That does again suggest a sort of shortening of the networks that maintain the province. Generally speaking, the terminal date of Roman Britain is placed around the usurpation of Constantine III, which is in AD 407, or in AD 410, which is the Honorian Rescript, which is essentially the people of Britain being told that the Roman Empire can no longer protect them. So what we do know is that the last consignments of Roman bronze coinage arrived between 395 and 402, which again makes that coin of Arcadius incredibly important, because it suggests we've still got coinage here right up till the end. So, looking at all of this, is Britain a nation in decline? Well, for this we're going to go back to Bermondsey. And again, you can see a number of excavations that took place here, undertaken by pre-construct archaeology, and they have produced some fascinating results. So this was an excavation undertaken on Stephen Street in Bermondsey, and the material that came from this site is incredibly similar to what we're getting here. Lots of pottery, lots of that sort of hypercoarse tile that you can see there again, a ceramic building material as we call it. Nice wall plaster as well, and things like Carrara marble as well. So quite high status stuff. And lots of coins too, and these are incredibly similar to the coins that we get here. The ones at Bermondsey mostly dated 330 to 378, but you can see lots of interesting things being shown on this coinage. Particularly interesting is that the emperor quite often is holding a sort of staff that has the Chi Rho on it, PX, which suggests conversion to Christianity. Lots of barbarian crushing going on and winged victories and stuff like that as well. Coinage obviously being a very significant form of propaganda. So what did this information mean then, and what's it got to do with Fulham? Well, according to Martin Millett, late Roman Britain in fact represents a flowering of the countryside and the culmination of Roman Britain's achievements. So actually Britain's doing quite well in the late Roman period as opposed to being in complete decline. The emphasis of settlement appears to move away from the civitates in the sort of urban areas to more sort of peripheral regions. And the archaeological record does actually support an increase in villa numbers, the emergence of nucleated settlements, and a diversification in agricultural production. So again, you can see what I'm saying here. Fulham's kind of fitting into that quite nicely. The 3rd and 4th centuries witnessed this major phase of villa development, with the villa seen as a status symbol of wealth and power. So essentially, at that point, you're seeing Romanitas moving down the social scale. So as sort of somewhere like Fulham, the local landowner might think, yeah, you know, I quite fancy getting myself one of those villas. So, who were the occupants of these villas and how did they function? Well, what is a villa exactly? According to Percival, a villa is a place in the country, normally, but not always associated with farming, sometimes with connotations of luxury or relaxation, something like a bathhouse perhaps, and in most cases a single house rather than a group of them. Cicero states that a villa is a building in the country as opposed to one in the town, which is an ides. A villa and its land, aga, together form a fundus or estate. Land in the town is not aga, but area. So there you have it. A slight rural dwelling. Not as fancy as you might think something like Fishbourne is, but you're seeing that kind of Romanitas sweeping down, and sort of people before who probably weren't living in such luxury, totally buying into the concept of Romanitas. Now, we don't know exactly who lived in such dwellings, that's lost in the annals of time, but they could have been city dwellers building country retreats, or people with newfound wealth, or perhaps even Gallic families escaping barbarian incursions and purchasing British real estate and moving over here, which is another possibility. So the late Roman villa in Britain is very different to the early Roman villas in that it's what might be referred to as a secondary type of villa structure, evolving from timber buildings to modest stone structures, sometimes referred to as cottage type villas or workaday villas, so not these huge things that you see in places like Fishbourne. They do express this taste for rural Romanitas, and perhaps the emergence almost of a nouveau riche, investment in land by the urban elite, landed gentry entering the political sphere possibly. They're not uncommon, believe it or not, and indicate that Britain was in fact both prosperous and secure during the late Roman period. So Britain's actually doing fairly well, and you're sort of seeing development of villas as wealth is fairly abundant. So the question is, do we have a villa at Fulham? Well, topographically, there are a number of requirements that you would need for a villa. You need a situation on free draining soils, such as terrace gravels, which Fulham sits on, proximity to a river valley or coastal and inland waterway for the import and export of goods, that's a definite tick. Landward communication in proximity to a major road, well in Fulham's case both the Roman road from Putney to Aikman Street to the north, the Ludgate to Hammersmith stretches there, so that's another tick. And the fact that very late Roman coinage is present on the site also is incredibly important, in that many other comparable sites have no coinage post AD 380. So this site continues right up to the end of Roman Britain. So, what happens after that? We know that we've got a Roman settlement, we know that it's here in the very late Roman period, but with that Honorian rescript in AD 410, well, what happens then? What happens? So, we do have sherds of Saxon pottery here, and some of them are incredibly early, which is between AD 400 and 600, and that sort of stuff is fairly rare. So, in AD 406, Britain witnesses 3 usurpations under Marcus Gratian and Constantine III. In AD 10, the British revolt takes place. Faced with the barbarian menace, the usurper's administration is removed and the rule of Roman Britain ends. So with the collapse of the Roman rule, there's no need to produce surplus for the Roman army in the Rhineland, which may well be where this money's coming from, or on Hadrian's Wall. But that changes everything. The position of the landowners is no longer secure, the choice of maintaining the status quo in a land with no structure, or you could potentially hire mercenaries to enforce your will and defend the interests. So landowners are very much so in a predicament here. The possibility of following that second one though, and getting mercenaries in, does of course to carry the risk of betrayal, and that they may decide that they quite fancy taking your land. So the end result of all of this is that Britain returns to an agrarian economy. Urban life completely vanishes, there's no tax, there's no money economy, there's no mass production of goods. German immigration into the nation is believed to have begun in around about AD 420. So it may not look like particularly much, but this is a very early Saxon piece of early Saxon pottery, so again at 400 to 600, and this was found again in the walled garden in 2014. Now, what's exciting about this, although it's a pretty poor piece of pottery, I mean, when you look at it, you've gone from that lovely Roman stuff to, in some cases, some of this stuff has bits of grass in it, you know, it's like the bloke who knew how to make the pot left. But it is incredibly significant in that generally early Saxon society is fairly aceramic. So we do have pottery covering the entire Saxon period here, but the early material is probably the most important. It is a real backward step in terms of what was being produced. So what do we know about these early Saxon settlement patterns then? Well, again, it's not called the Dark Ages for nothing. The material culture of the 5th and 6th centuries is not brilliantly well understood, and the assemblages in the London region are particularly small. They're usually dispersed, and they appear to be located along the river terraces on the north, west and south sides of the Roman city of Londinium. Now, the reasons for this, again, very much so rely upon the Thames, and we should never forget how important the Thames is during this period. It is the major migratory route. So just up the river in Hammersmith, an excavation was undertaken in 1990, and a very early Saxon settlement was found there, with things like structures, pits, gullies, and what we call sunken feature buildings, which are early Saxon forms of houses, and that predates AD 550. So we do know that the Saxons are here in the very early Saxon period. But you have to look at it in a way where you don't think, well, things don't just change overnight. There has to be a period of continuity. So there is a clear link between early Saxon settlement and late Roman villa complexes. We see this at places like Beddington, Orpington and Keston. Quite often, upstanding Roman structures offered the possibility of inhabitation for these new arrivals. They are on good agricultural land, obviously, and although the Saxon society is now completely different, you still need to produce goods, you still need to produce crops, even if that's at an incredibly minimal level. So the late Roman occupation suggests a decline post AD 360, with some villa sites sort of retreating into themselves a little bit. You're getting conversion of villas into various other areas and being subdivided. Some seem to have been used for storing and processing foodstuffs. That may be due to raids, etc. But here that doesn't quite work, in the sense that we seem to have this activity just running straight through to the end of the Roman period. But we do see Roman villas as forming a sort of focus for Saxon communities arriving. Cemeteries often represent significant change here as they start to bury their dead around sort of Roman villa structures. So whereas the villa may have represented the centre of an elite power base in the Roman period, they are now representing in the Saxon period a place for the elite in death. They certainly view these structures as significant. And a classic example here is the Orpington bathhouse in Belfield Road in Orpington, where you have a late Roman bathhouse there, and all of these Saxon burials around this structure. So the early Saxon arrivals do seem to have been drawn to these upstanding Roman buildings, which are very much different to the way that they lived and the structures they built. The problem is, of course, is that this sort of late Roman, early Saxon transition is incredibly complex. The evidence does suggest there's a form of continuity, but there's so many questions. I mean, is this the local indigenous population, or does it represent new arrivals, or a mixture of the two? A process of acculturation, maybe, a real melting pot sort of happening, as it were. And again, we're seeing this in Fulham, and we're seeing it in places like Bermondsey too. The end result is that you have an aceramic, self-sufficient society with an agrarian and barter-based economy. And by the end of the 5th century, the dynamics of the Roman Empire have completely disappeared. But for me, this does raise a number of questions, in that, why do I have all this late Roman pottery at the end, towards the southern end of the site, and then early Saxon pottery as well? That again suggests this kind of continuity. It's not like the site was abandoned or left. It looks like it continued to be settled and used, just as those other examples I've given you, like Keston and Orpington. And I do start to wonder about perhaps how old All Saints really is. And again, I'm going to look at Bermondsey here, because essentially what you see here is the transition from a Roman villa, which is on Stephen Street there in the top right-hand corner, towards a Saxon Minster church, and then that eventually becoming Bermondsey Abbey on the south side of the road there. So Fulham is sort of drawing quite a lot of comparisons for me here. Now, continuing those sort of thoughts about the palace before the bishops, what you can see in this slide here is essentially what was the Fulham stream in the picture on the right, running towards Putney Bridge. You can see there's a big ditch there. That's later canalised into a drain, with most of the ditch being filled in the 18th century. But at the bottom of the picture, you can see that curved bit of brickwork, and that represents our part of the moat that lies between the walled garden and All Saints Church, what Lucy calls the churchyard stretch. And that does appear to have been constructed later on. So it's canalised off the Fulham stream, which ran all the way down to where Putney Bridge is now, forming a later boundary within the manor, as it were, and separating the palace from All Saints. So this is my former colleague, Matt Edmonds, and a good friend of mine, and he dug up that site on Fulham High Street, which had this stream on it. So from his work and his evidence there, we know that the stream was subject to damming in the 16th century, and it had been infilled by the 18th century. The earliest pottery recovered from that churchyard stretch of the moat dates between 1270 and 1350, so it's possible that that's excavated or created in the sort of late medieval period. A bridge appears to have been constructed across it between 1450 and 1600 as well. So was this part of the sort of the manor grounds dug when the palace was rebuilt in the 13th century? Quite possible. Certainly that piece of pottery would suggest that's about right. So we may be seeing a major shift at that point, with a new palace being built and a real separation between All Saints and the manor. Or is it possible that something else is going on? Well, also on that site, we found this lovely 17th century cellar wall, or PCA did, I should say. And that's actually made up of some very, very interesting stone. So there's some very strange elements within that building, and they represent elements from a major ecclesiastical structure. So lots of Kentish ragstone in it, some Hassock stone, which comes from Surrey, sometimes sort of referred to as Reigate stone. But there's also this rather interesting stone called Quar stone in it, which comes from the Isle of Wight. Now that's quite rare in London, and it's usually associated with Saxo-Norman buildings, so I think you can probably see the point that I'm trying to make here. And this is the White Tower at the Tower of London, and of course the lower brickwork in that is Quar stone. So is it possible that All Saints' origins go way back to the Saxon period, and may sort of continue on from that potential Roman villa? Some really, really nice stuff. You can see a mason's mark on that piece on the left-hand side, and this really nice sort of worked stone on the right. Very, very, very nice stuff. But that did get me thinking, of course. And obviously the Vikings in Fulham are very much so part of the history here. So what do we know about the Vikings in Fulham? Well, in AD 878, the Viking Guthrum invades Wessex. Around the same time, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records another force in the Thames at Fulham, and this force is supposed to have stayed for 2 years, eventually departing for Ghent. So the assumption's always been that these Vikings in Fulham were a major army, a large fleet of Northmen. But again, we have absolutely no archaeological evidence for this whatsoever. So you can see what it actually says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I'm not even going to try and read that to you. But it translates as, and that year a gang of Vikings gathered and settled at Fulham on the Thames. So the word that's used in the Chronicle there, chlop, that means a band or a company, which would suggest a small group as opposed to hera, which means army. Okay, so it's starting to look less like an army. So Fulham may have acted as a muster point rather than home to a large army, a location zone for a gathering and possibly recruiting more people, so trying to gather more people together. So we're going to look at Viking fortifications then. So what do we know about them? Well, they're generally D-shaped, and the example from Repton, which you can see in the top picture in the bottom right-hand corner, that represents the winter camp of the Great Army of AD 873 to 874. Located on the River Trent, that encompasses 1.46 hectares. So we do know that Vikings made use of offshore and estuarine islands and major waterways for overwintering, which again Fulham would very much so sort of fit into. But these were normally for middling to large armies. So could Fulham have been occupied with the moat employed for defensive purposes? The problem with that is, if we look at Roke's map, the general shape of the moat, which we also think is natural, shows it as trapezoidal in shape, and it's a huge area of 14.5 hectares. So it seems pretty unlikely that if you're going to settle a piece of land as a Viking, even with a large army, that you're going to try and defend that amount of space. So it's probably pretty unlikely, and there is a distinct lack of that supportive archaeological evidence, and we just haven't found any yet. But when we look at Repton, you do start to wonder why they set it up particularly where they did. And again, you can see that D-shaped enclosure is formed around St Winston's Church. So again, you're probably starting to see the kind of direction I'm taking this in. Now, if I was to do this, follow that churchyard stretch of moat and form a kind of D shape around All Saints with the channel running down to Putney Bridge, that starts to look a bit more interesting, doesn't it? And that is just 1.95 hectares. So a theory, but you know, I kind of like the idea of it. And again, if you're going to target something as a Viking, the money's going to be very much so where the church is too. That could, of course, just be pub talk, however. And you can see an old photo of me there with some hair. That's nice, isn't it? The end.